Did you ever stop to think that the most dangerous object in the galaxy might be sitting in someone's garage, wedged between a broken lawnmower and a box of Christmas decorations? The Galactic Council chamber fell silent as the human delegation entered. It wasn't the usual diplomatic tension that froze the air. It was something else. Something primal. Every alien representative in that vast circular room felt it the moment Captain Marcus Webb stepped through the archway. The Etherean diplomats, with their crystalline skin that reflected every spectrum of light, dimmed to a dull grey. The Krell War Masters, beings who had conquered 17 star systems through sheer tactical genius, instinctively reached for weapons that weren't there. Even the ancient Vex observers, creatures who had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations for millennia, leaned forward in their floating meditation spheres. It wasn't Webb they were staring at. It was what hung at his hip, a sword. Simple, unremarkable to human eyes. The blade was old, weathered steel with a leather-wrapped grip that had seen better days. No glowing runes, no humming energy field, no elaborate craftsmanship that screamed of legendary forges or master smiths. Just a sword, the kind you might find in any number of places across Earth. Flea markets, antique shops, estate sales. Except this one had come from a garage sale in suburban Ohio for $5. And right now, it was causing a minor panic among some of the most powerful beings in known space. High Cleric Thainzel of the Holy Varathian Order rose from his seat with such force that his ceremonial robes swirled like storm clouds. He was impressive even by alien standards. Nearly 9 feet tall, with 4 arms that ended in long, elegant fingers, and a face that seemed carved from living marble. His species had been the spiritual guides of the galaxy for over 50,000 years. They didn't just practice religion, they lived it, breathed it. Their entire civilization was built on the foundation of divine law and cosmic order. And right now, Thainzel looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Impossible," he whispered, but the word carried across the chamber like thunder. "The blade of Korseth. Here, now, in the hands of..." He struggled with the word, as if it physically pained him to say it. "A human." Webb shifted uncomfortably. He'd been briefed about potential cultural sensitivities before this meeting. Earth was new to the galactic stage, barely a century since first contact. Humanity was still learning the rules, the protocols, the thousands of unspoken agreements that kept dozens of species from tearing each other apart. But nobody had mentioned anything about swords. He'd brought it because, well, Admiral Chen had specifically requested he wear his full ceremonial attire. Webb had assumed that meant his dress uniform. He'd added the sword as a personal touch, a family heirloom, or so he'd thought. His grandfather had carried it in the Second World War, or at least that was the story. The truth was a bit more mundane and a lot more embarrassing. "Your Holiness," Webb began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I think there might be some confusion. This is just... Thainzel descended from his platform, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. The other delegates parted like water. "That weapon you carry so casually at your side is not just anything human. It is the Korseth, the sundering blade, the edge of creation. It was forged in the heart of a dying star by the first builders themselves, tempered in the tears of the void, and blessed by entities your species doesn't even have names for." Webb glanced down at the sword. It looked exactly like it had that Saturday morning 6 months ago when he'd stopped at a garage sale in Columbus. Old lady, nice smile, said it belonged to her late husband. Seemed like a decent addition to his collection. $5. She'd even thrown in a set of vintage coffee mugs for free. He'd actually haggled her down from $8. "With respect," Webb said carefully, "I bought this at a garage sale for $5. There were also some commemorative spoons and a VHS copy of Jurassic Park. I don't think..." The chamber erupted, not in anger, but in something worse: confusion, disbelief, fear. The Krell Warmaster stood so quickly his chair clattered to the floor. The Etherian delegation began speaking in rapid, overlapping harmonics that Webb's translator couldn't keep up with. One of the smaller species, the insectoid Chithi, actually fainted, its carapace clicking against the polished floor. Thainzel raised one of his forehands for silence. It took several minutes for the chaos to subside. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of ages. "Human Captain Webb, do you understand what you've done? The blade of Korseth has been lost for 12,000 years. We have searched. We have prayed. We have sent expeditions to the furthest reaches of known space. Entire orders of clerics have dedicated their lives to finding even a whisper of its location. And you," he seemed to be physically restraining himself, "you purchased it at a garage sale? $5, Webb repeated, because apparently his brain had decided that detail was important. "There was a whole box of old tools and stuff. I also got a pretty decent set of wrenches." A low, dangerous rumble spread through the chamber. Thainzel's eyes, which had been a calm blue, shifted to something closer to violet. "That blade," he said slowly, "is said to be wielded only by those chosen by the divine, by beings of such purity and purpose that the universe itself bends to acknowledge them. Emperors have failed to lift it. Saints have been found unworthy. I myself, after a century of devotion and service, attempted to grasp it during the last recorded sighting. It burned my hands so severely I couldn't use them for a year." He extended one hand, showing scars that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. "And yet you just bought it?" Webb was beginning to sense that this meeting was not going according to plan. "Look, if this is some kind of sacred artifact, I'm happy to return it or donate it to a museum or whatever the galactic equivalent is. I didn't mean any disrespect. Nobody told me it was special." "Draw it," Thainzel commanded. "What?" "Draw the blade. Let us see if what I suspect is true." The cleric's voice had taken on a strange quality, not hostile but intensely curious, almost hungry. Webb hesitated. Every instinct screamed that this was a bad idea. But he was also acutely aware that he was standing in front of representatives from 40 different species, most of whom could probably vaporize him with a thought. Slowly, carefully, he gripped the worn leather handle and drew the sword. The blade slid free with a soft whisper of steel on leather. Nothing dramatic, no flash of light, no surge of power, just a sword. Old, slightly rusted in places, but sharp. He'd spent an evening last month cleaning it up. What happened next would be debated in academic circles for generations. Thainzel didn't gasp or cry out. He simply dropped to his knees, all four hands pressed to the ground in a gesture of absolute submission. Within seconds, every Varathian in the chamber had done the same. Then the Krell, then the Etherians. One by one, species after species, until only the humans remained standing, looking at each other with expressions of complete bewilderment. "Blessed are we," Thainzel whispered, "to witness the chosen in our lifetime." He raised his eyes to meet Webb's, and there was something in that gaze that made the captain's blood run cold. Not hatred, not anger, but absolute, unwavering certainty. "Tell me, human, what else did you find at this garage sale?" Webb's mind raced backward to that Saturday morning, trying to reconstruct every detail with a clarity that suddenly felt desperately important. The garage sale had been unremarkable, one of hundreds that dotted the suburbs every weekend when the weather turned nice. He'd stopped, because he always stopped. Old habits from his college days when furnishing an apartment on a military stipend meant getting creative. The house had been a modest ranch style with yellow siding and a garden that had seen better days. The old woman, Mrs. Patterson, she'd said her name was. Gray hair pulled back in a bun. Floral print dress. She'd been pleasant in that distinctly Midwestern way, offering him lemonade while he browsed through boxes of accumulated decades. There was a telescope, Webb said slowly, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. Old brass one. Looked like it was from the early 1900s. Some vinyl records. Jazz mostly. A set of encyclopedias from the 80s. He paused, trying to remember what else had caught his eye. A leather jacket, some camping equipment, books, lots of books, science fiction paperbacks, philosophy texts, a few languages I didn't recognize. I thought maybe they were just decorative. Thainsel's expression shifted from reverence to something approaching panic. Languages you didn't recognize. Show me your communication device. Now. Webb pulled out his tablet, scrolling through the photos he'd taken that day. He'd developed a habit of documenting interesting finds, mostly for insurance purposes. The images flowed past. Boxes of kitchenware, furniture, garden tools. Then he stopped. There, in the background of a shot he'd taken of some vintage cameras, was a book. Leather-bound, sitting innocuously on a folding table between a coffee maker and a stack of National Geographic magazines. The cover bore symbols that seemed to shift even in the still image, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. The cleric leaned in, and for the first time since Webb had entered the chamber, he looked genuinely afraid. "The Codex of Infinite Paths," he breathed. "Did you, please tell me you did not purchase this book?" "I bought everything on that table," Webb admitted. "It was a bulk deal. $20 for the lot." He didn't mention that Mrs. Patterson had seemed almost eager to get rid of it all, practically forcing him to take items he hadn't even expressed interest in. At the time, he thought she was just lonely, wanting someone to appreciate her late husband's things. Now, as he recalled the look in her eyes, there had been something else. Relief, maybe. Or warning. A new voice cut through the tension. Commander Reese, the human diplomatic liaison, stepped forward. She was a composed woman in her 50s who'd built her career on staying calm during interstellar incidents. But even she looked shaken. "Captain Webb, I need you to tell me exactly where these items are right now." "My apartment, Alexandria, Virginia. Most of it's still in boxes in my spare room. I haven't really had time to go through everything properly." The words sounded absurd even as he said them. Apparently he'd been using the galactic equivalent of the Holy Grail as a bookend for the past 6 months. The chamber erupted again, but this time it was coordinated chaos. Delegates were speaking rapidly into communication devices. The Krell War Master was barking orders to someone off-screen. Even the normally placid Vex observers had abandoned their meditation spheres and were conversing in their strange telepathic way that made the air shimmer with unspoken urgency. Thainsel had gone perfectly still, all 4 hands pressed together in a gesture that Webb's cultural database identified as a prayer for protection against cosmic catastrophe. "You don't understand," the cleric said, and for the first time his voice carried no arrogance or superiority. Just raw, unfiltered fear. "The Blade of Korseth was never meant to be alone. It is part of a set. 7 artifacts, each one a tool of creation and destruction. Individually they are powerful enough to reshape worlds. Together." He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. "They have been scattered across the cosmos specifically to prevent anyone from assembling them. We've spent millennia ensuring they remain separate, and you're telling me that at least 2, possibly more, were sitting in a garage in Ohio?" Webb felt something cold settle in his stomach. How would they have gotten there? Earth is barely a blip on the galactic timeline. We've only been spacefaring for a century. Before that, we were isolated. "That," said Ambassador Krell Noth, the War Master, "is an excellent question." The reptilian alien moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent their life preparing for threats. "Clerics deal in faith and prophecy. I deal in facts. And the fact is, someone brought those artifacts to your world. Someone who knew what they were. Someone who wanted them hidden where no one would think to look. His scaled face twisted into what might have been a smile. And someone who underestimated human curiosity and your species' peculiar fondness for purchasing random objects at discounted prices. A thin, reedy voice spoke up from the Chithi delegation. The insectoid who'd fainted earlier had recovered, though its mandibles still clicked nervously. Permission to present historical data? When Thainsel nodded, the Chithi tapped a control surface, and a holographic display materialized in the center of the chamber. Cross-referencing temporal signatures and artifact disappearances. Approximately 12,000 standard years ago, 7 major relics vanished from recorded space. The Blade of Korseth from the Varathian Holy Vaults. The Codex of Infinite Paths from the Library of Endless Knowing. The remaining 5 from various locations across the galaxy. At the time, this was attributed to the Sundering War, a conflict so catastrophic that it erased entire civilizations from existence. The hologram shifted, showing a timeline punctuated with gaps and uncertainties. However, there are fragmentary records of a ship, a vessel of unknown origin that appeared briefly near several worlds before vanishing entirely. The last confirmed sighting was in a region of space that your species would later designate as the Sol System, Earth's solar system. This was approximately 12,000 years ago, long before humanity developed even rudimentary technology. Webb's hand tightened on the sword's grip. The leather felt warm now, almost alive. You're saying someone hid these things on Earth, deliberately, 12,000 years ago? Not just hid them, Commander Reese interjected, her tactical mind already working through implications. They hid them in plain sight, disguised as ordinary objects, waiting. She turned to Webb. Captain, think carefully. This Mrs. Patterson. Did she say anything unusual? Anything about her husband or where these items came from? He closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember. The conversation had been casual, forgettable. Weather, traffic, the usual pleasantries. But there had been one moment. He'd asked about the sword, commented on the craftsmanship. Mrs. Patterson had touched it gently, almost reverently. What had she said? My husband always told me it would find its way to the right person eventually. He said the universe has a way of putting things where they need to be. At the time, Webb had thought it was just sentimental talk. Old people often attached meaning to objects. When he relayed this to the chamber, Thainsel's expression transformed from fear to something approaching awe. The universe has a way. Those are not the words of a human widow. They are scripture, ancient Vorathian scripture, from texts that predate your species by millions of years, texts that were lost in the same war that scattered the artifacts. So what are you saying? Webb demanded. That Mrs. Patterson was some kind of alien in disguise? A guardian who'd been watching these things for 12 millennia? I'm saying, Thainsel replied carefully, that your species may have had visitors long before we made official contact. Visitors who integrated so thoroughly that you never noticed, who lived among you, who became you. He paused, weighing his next words. The prophecies speak of the caretakers, beings tasked with safeguarding creation's most dangerous tools until a time when they would be needed again. A time when the galaxy faces a threat so profound that even separation and hiding would no longer be enough. A time when the tools must be wielded, not hidden. And you think that time is now? Commander Reese asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. The chamber's massive viewport suddenly polarized, darkening to show the star field beyond. But something was wrong with the view. The stars were moving, shifting in patterns that defied natural orbital mechanics. One by one, they were going dark. Not dimming or dying, but simply ceasing to exist, as if something was erasing them from reality itself. The effect was spreading, a wave of absolute nothing consuming everything in its path. It was still distant, light years away, but it was coming, and it was accelerating. Thainsel's voice was barely a whisper, The void hunger. The true reason the artifacts were created in the first place. The reason they were hidden when they could not be used. And now, after 12,000 years of dormancy, it has awakened again. He looked at Webb with an expression that mixed terror and hope in equal measure. Captain, I do not know how or why the universe chose you, but the blade of Korzeth only allows itself to be wielded by those it deems worthy. You did not simply find it at a garage sale, it found you. And if the other artifacts are also in your possession, then perhaps... He couldn't finish the sentence, as if speaking the words might jinx whatever slim chance they had. You need to return to Earth, now, and we need to see exactly what else you bought that day. The journey back to Earth took 6 hours using the Council's fastest diplomatic vessel, a sleek Etherean cruiser that bent space-time like paper. Webb spent most of it staring at the sword laid across his lap, trying to reconcile the weathered steel with the religious fervor it had inspired. Thainsul sat across from him in the cramped passenger compartment, silent and motionless in that unnerving way his species had perfected. The cleric hadn't spoken since they'd left the station, but his eyes never left the blade. Commander Reese occupied herself with securing the appropriate clearances and permissions, her voice clipped and professional as she navigated the bureaucratic maze of bringing an alien religious delegation onto Earth soil with minimal notice and maximum security. Webb found himself thinking about his grandfather. The man had died when Webb was 12, but the memories remained vivid. A quiet man who'd worked at the post office for 40 years after the war, who'd grown tomatoes in his backyard and listened to jazz on Sunday mornings, who'd never spoken much about his time in the service except to say that he'd been a translator, stationed mostly in Europe. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that explained how he'd come to possess a weapon forged in the heart of a dying star by beings that predated human civilization. Unless, of course, he hadn't possessed it at all. Unless it had possessed him, guided him, waited with the patience of eons for the moment when it would be needed again. He knew, Webb said, suddenly breaking the silence. My grandfather, he must have known what it was. Thainsul stirred, his marble-like features catching the strange blue light of faster-than-light travel. The caretakers always know. It is their burden and their purpose. They are chosen not for their strength or wisdom, but for their ability to live ordinary lives, to hide in plain sight, to resist the temptation of power. The cleric's voice carried a weight of sadness. Your grandfather carried that blade through a war. Do you know how many times he must have been tempted to use its true power? To end conflicts with a single stroke, to reshape reality according to his vision of justice? And yet he never did. He kept it sheathed. He kept it hidden. He protected not just the artifact, but the galaxy from itself. And then he gave it to some lady in Ohio who sold it for $5 at a garage sale, Webb muttered. Seems like a pretty significant security failure. Does it? Thainsul leaned forward, and his 4 eyes focused with an intensity that made Webb want to look away. Or is that exactly what was supposed to happen? The prophecies are unclear about many things, but they are consistent on one point. When the void hunger returns, the artifacts will choose their wielders, not through tests of strength or demonstrations of worthiness, but through circumstances that appear random, chaotic, even absurd, because beings of pure purpose are drawn to spectacle and ceremony. But true warriors, true protectors, are found in the mundane moments, in the decision to stop at a garage sale, in the curiosity that makes someone examine a box of old books, in the $5 spent without hesitation or calculation. The cruiser shuddered as it dropped out of FTL, Earth's blue marble swelling in the viewport. Webb had seen it from space dozens of times, but it never stopped catching his breath. Home. 7 billion people going about their lives, completely unaware that the stars were going dark and something incomprehensible was consuming reality itself. He wondered how long they had. Weeks. Months. The void hunger had looked distant from the council station, but space was deceptive. Distance meant nothing when you were talking about something that could erase light years of existence. His apartment building in Alexandria looked exactly as he'd left it 3 days ago. Red brick, slightly weathered, with a parking lot that always had too few spaces and a lobby that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and someone's cooking. Webb had chosen it because it was close to the Pentagon and cheap enough to be practical on a captain's salary. Now, as he led an entourage that included a 9-foot-tall alien cleric, 2 Krell war specialists, Commander Reese, and a full security detail, he felt acutely aware of how absurdly normal everything looked. Mrs. Chen from 3B was checking her mailbox. The Supers kid was skateboarding in the parking lot. Life, continuing with the oblivious momentum of routine. The spare bedroom of Webb's apartment was exactly as chaotic as he remembered. Boxes stacked 3 high, some still taped shut, others opened and rifled through when he'd been looking for specific items. His dress uniform hung on the back of the door. A folding table served as a makeshift desk, covered in papers and tablet screens, showing unfinished reports. This was where he came to decompress after missions, to sort through the accumulated debris of a life spent mostly in space. And somewhere in these boxes was potentially the key to saving the galaxy from annihilation. Thainsel entered the room with the caution of someone approaching a live explosive. His eyes swept across the stacked containers, and Webb saw something flicker across the alien's face. Recognition, fear, wonder. There, the cleric whispered, pointing to a box near the window. Do you feel it? The resonance? Webb didn't feel anything except increasingly out of his depth, but he moved to the indicated box and opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in newspaper from 6 months ago, were the items from Mrs. Patterson's folding table, the leather-bound book that had appeared in his photo, a brass compass that looked Victorian, a small wooden box with intricate carvings, a snow globe containing what he'd thought was a miniature cityscape, but now, looking closer, seemed far more complex. And a simple clay cup, the kind you might use for tea, unremarkable except for the fact that it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. 5. Thainsel counted, his voice shaking. 5 of the 7 artifacts, in a box, in a spare bedroom, wrapped in newspaper. He looked at Webb with an expression that might have been laughter if it wasn't so clearly bordering on hysteria. The Codex of Infinite Paths, which contains every possible timeline and outcome. The Compass of True North, which points not to magnetic poles but to cosmic purpose. The Box of Unmaking, which can contain anything, even concepts. The Globe of Spheres, a map of not just space but all possible spaces. And the Cup of First Waters, from which the universe itself is said to have drunk. He paused. Where are the other 2? Webb thought back to that Saturday. I didn't buy everything. There was a mirror, big ornate thing with a gold frame, too large for my apartment, and a key, old iron, looked medieval. I almost took it because I collect keys, but Mrs. Patterson said those weren't for sale. She seemed pretty firm about it. He remembered now how her demeanor had shifted when he'd reached for them. Not angry, but definite. She said they were promised to someone else. The cleric absorbed this information with visible relief. Then they are still in play, still hidden. The mirror would be the reflection of truth, which shows not what is but what could be. The key is the unlocker, which opens doors between realities. He carefully lifted the codex from the box, handling it with a reverence that made clear this was as close to divinity as his species understood. Captain Webb, I need you to understand something. These artifacts are not weapons in any conventional sense. They are tools of creation itself. The blade cuts through possibility, allowing reality to be reshaped. The codex shows all paths. The compass finds purpose, The box contains the globe maps, the cup nourishes, the mirror reflects truth, the key opens ways. He set the book down gently. Separately, they are dangerous. Together, they could remake existence or end it. Then, why were they created? Commander Reese asked from the doorway. She'd been coordinating with the security teams, but her tactical mind clearly couldn't stay away from the strategic implications. Because, a new voice answered, sometimes the only way to fight nothing is with everything. Everyone turned. Standing in the hallway, looking exactly as she had 6 months ago except for an expression that carried the weight of ages, was Mrs. Patterson. The floral dress was the same. The grey hair pulled back in a bun was the same. But her eyes, God, her eyes were different. They held depths that made Webb's mind hurt to contemplate, swirling with colors that shouldn't exist and knowledge that predated human language. "Hello, Marcus," she said, and her voice resonated with harmonics that made the artifacts in the box hum in response. "I'm glad you decided to stop that day. I've been waiting a very long time to meet you." Thainsel dropped to his knees so quickly Webb heard the joints crack. "Caretaker Prime, the prophecy spoke of your return." Mrs. Patterson, or whatever she really was, smiled sadly. "Prophecies. You and your people put so much faith in predictions, Thainsel. But prophecies are just probabilities given poetry. Yes, I've been here, watching, waiting, living 1,000 lives under 1,000 names, always guarding, always preparing for the day when the void would wake again." She moved into the room with a grace that made her earlier elderly shuffle seem like theater. "And yes, I put these artifacts where Marcus would find them. Not by chance, not by fate, by design. Because I've watched him his entire life, watched him make choices, small ones. A child who shared his lunch with the new kid who had none. A teenager who stood up to bullies even when it cost him friendships. A young officer who questioned orders that felt wrong, even when obedience would have been easier. A man who stops at garage sales and sees value in things other people discard." Webb felt something crack open inside his chest, a realization that was both terrifying and inevitable. "How long have you been watching me?" "Since the day you were born," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Since the day your grandfather, who was also one of us, died and passed the responsibility forward. We knew the timeline. We knew when the void would return. And we knew that the artifacts would need someone who could wield them, not with certainty, but with doubt. Not with divine purpose, but with human hesitation. Because absolute conviction is what created the void in the first place. Being so certain of their righteousness that they tried to erase everything that disagreed with them, and in doing so, became nothing themselves. An absence that hungers for all that is." The apartment's windows suddenly went dark, not with curtains but with an absence of light that felt physical. Outside, the normal sounds of the city vanished, replaced by a silence so complete it pressed against Webb's eardrums like water pressure. Then came a sound, not loud but deep, a vibration that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond the three-dimensional space they occupied. The artifacts in the box began to glow, each with its own distinct light. The sword at Webb's hip grew hot enough that he could feel it through the scabbard. Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from nostalgic to urgent. "It's here. Faster than we anticipated. The void has found you, Marcus, found the artifacts, and now you have a choice to make." She gestured to the glowing objects. "Take them up. Use them. Save the galaxy. Or refuse and watch everything end. But understand this. Once you wield them, once you accept what they offer, you cannot unknow what they'll show you, cannot unsee what they'll reveal. Your life as you've known it ends either way. The only question is whether existence itself ends with it." Webb looked at the artifacts. At Thainsel still kneeling in reverence. At Commander Reese calculating odds and strategies. At Mrs. Patterson who had worn a mask of humanity for longer than his species had possessed written language. And he thought about $5, about the absurd randomness of stopping at a garage sale, about his grandfather growing tomatoes and listening to jazz while carrying the weight of cosmic secrets, about how sometimes the most important moments in history hinge on the smallest choices. He reached into the box and picked up the codex, its leather warm and alive under his fingers. The moment his skin made contact, the book opened and he saw everything, every choice, every outcome, every possible path branching into infinity. And among them all, one path that glowed brighter than the rest. Not with certainty of success, but with possibility, with hope. And that, he realized, was enough. It had to be enough. The moment Webb touched the codex, reality fractured into 1,000 crystalline shards, each one reflecting a different version of what could be. He saw himself wielding the blade, cutting through the advancing darkness with strokes that rewrote the fundamental laws of physics. He saw himself drinking from the cup and gaining understanding that turned his mind into something vast and terrifying. He saw himself opening the box and containing the void entirely, trapping it in a space smaller than an atom but larger than galaxies. He saw triumph, he saw failure, he saw everything in between. But what struck him most profoundly was what connected all the successful paths, and it wasn't power or divine intervention or cosmic destiny. It was doubt. In every timeline where he saved the galaxy, he questioned himself. Hesitated, chose carefully rather than decisively, because the void hadn't been created by evil or malice. It had been born from certainty, from being so convinced of their righteousness that they'd tried to impose absolute order on a universe that thrived on chaos, and in their zealotry they'd created an absence so profound it consumed even them. Webb set the codex down gently and picked up the sword, drawing it fully for the second time that day. The blade sang as it left the scabbard, a note that seemed to harmonize with the fundamental frequency of existence itself. He expected it to feel heavy with the weight of cosmic significance, but instead it felt right, balanced, like holding a part of himself he'd never known was missing. Mrs. Patterson watched him with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall, and in her expression was something that might have been pride, or might have been sorrow, or perhaps both intertwined so completely they couldn't be separated. "The void responds to opposition," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence that had engulfed the building. "Fight it with force, and it becomes stronger. Resist it with absolute conviction, and you feed it exactly what it craves. But approach it with uncertainty, with the acknowledgement that you might be wrong, that there might be another way, and suddenly it has nothing to consume. Because doubt is anathema to absolute nothingness. Doubt implies possibility, and possibility is the opposite of void." Webb moved to the window, though there was nothing to see but darkness pressing against the glass like oil. Somewhere beyond that absence, his city existed. His planet. 7 billion people living their beautifully mundane lives, worried about traffic and bills and whether they'd remembered to lock the door. They deserve to wake up tomorrow and worry about those things again. They deserve the privilege of normal problems. He thought about his grandfather, who'd carried this sword through the hell of war and never used it, who'd chosen restraint over power every single day for decades. That, Webb realized, was the real test. Not whether you could wield ultimate power, but whether you could choose not to. "Show me," he said to the darkness, and he meant it not as a command, but as a request. The blade glowed in his hand, not with the fierce light of destruction, but with something softer, an invitation rather than a threat. And slowly, incredibly, the darkness responded. It didn't retreat or dissipate. Instead, it coalesced, took form, became something visible, comprehensible. What stood before them now wasn't a monster or an enemy. It was an absence given shape, a void wearing the memory of what it had once been. Beings of pure light and certainty, so convinced of their path that they'd erased their own possibility for change, and in doing so, had become the very nothing they'd fought against. "You were people," Webb said, "and it wasn't a question. You were civilizations. You believed so strongly in your truth that you couldn't allow for any other truth to exist. And so you became this. Not evil, just empty." The void shape rippled, and though it had no voice, Webb understood its response through the Codex's knowledge still resonating in his mind. Yes, we were certain. We were right. We were so right that we eliminated every possibility of being wrong. And in doing so, we eliminated ourselves. Now we hunger for that certainty in others. We consume it. We spread. Because if everything is nothing, then we were right all along. We win by making the universe as empty as we are. Thainsel rose from his kneeling position, understanding dawning across his features. The prophecies weren't about destruction. They were about recognition. About seeing the void not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a warning of what absolute faith becomes when it has no room for doubt. He looked at his own 4 hands, at the scars from when he'd tried to lift the blade decades ago. I failed because I was certain I was worthy, because I believed without question in my divine purpose. The blade burned me because certainty itself is a kind of fire that consumes possibility. Webb felt the weight of 7 artifacts calling to him, each one offering a different path. He could cut the void from reality entirely with the blade. He could trap it in the box. He could use the mirror to reflect back what it had been, forcing it to confront its own emptiness. But each of those solutions was absolute. Each was certain. Each fed the cycle that had created the void in the first place. So instead, he did something that made Thainsel gasp, and Commander Reese reach for her sidearm. He lowered the sword and offered it to the darkness. Not as a weapon, as a choice. "You can take this," Webb said steadily, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "You can consume it, and me and everything else. You can prove your certainty by erasing all possibility. Or you can choose uncertainty. You can choose to exist as questions rather than as the absence of answers. Because that's what these artifacts really are. They're not tools of power. They're reminders that nothing is absolute. That every answer contains new questions. That doubt isn't weakness, it's the only thing that keeps existence from collapsing into either total chaos or total void." The silence stretched so long that Webb wondered if he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The darkness pressed closer, and he could feel it examining the offer, weighing it with whatever passed for thought in a being that had erased its own consciousness. Then, slowly, the oppressive absence began to change. Not disappearing, but transforming. The darkness became shadow. Shadow became dusk. Dusk became the soft gray of uncertainty, of spaces between absolutes where new things could grow. The void shape reached out with something that might have been a hand, or might have been a tendril of reformed possibility, and it touched the blade gently. The sword didn't burn it, didn't cut it. Instead, it resonated, and in that resonance was a question the void had forgotten how to ask. What if we were wrong? Mrs. Patterson exhaled a breath she might have been holding for millennia. "You did it. You actually did it. Not by defeating them, but by offering them the one thing they'd denied themselves. The possibility of being mistaken." She moved to stand beside Webb, and for a moment she was every age at once, young and old, human and something far more ancient. "The artifacts will need to be scattered again, hidden in new places among new guardians, because this isn't a permanent solution. It's a pause, a reprieve. Certainty will always try to reassert itself. Void will always hunger at the edges of existence. But now we know the answer isn't to fight it with opposing certainty. It's to meet it with questions." Commander Reese lowered her weapon, her tactical mind already processing the implications. "How do we explain this to the Council? To Earth? Everyone saw the stars going dark. They'll want answers, decisive action, certainty. Then we tell them the truth, Webb said, sheathing the sword that had found him at a garage sale for $5. That the universe is held together, not by absolute laws or divine order, but by the constant tension between knowing and not knowing. That doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it's the thing that makes faith meaningful. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is admit you might be wrong and choose to act anyway. He looked around his spare bedroom, at the artifacts that would soon be separated and hidden again, at the alien cleric who'd learned to question his certainties, at the ancient guardian who'd worn humanity like a comfortable coat for generations. And maybe we tell them that the most important moments don't happen in grand councils or cosmic battlefields. They happen in garage sales and spare bedrooms and quiet decisions made by people who stopped to look at something everyone else passed by. The darkness was fully gone now, replaced by normal afternoon light streaming through windows that showed Alexandria going about its business, unaware that existence itself had just been renegotiated in apartment 4C. Mrs. Patterson began carefully wrapping the artifacts again, each one going back into its newspaper cocoon. "I'll take them," she said. "Distribute them where they need to be. Maybe a flea market in Tokyo, an estate sale in Mumbai, a charity shop in Lagos. Places where curious people stop and look at things others have discarded." She paused, holding the cup in her weathered hands. "Your grandfather would be proud, Marcus. He knew that carrying these things wasn't about being worthy. It was about being willing. Willing to doubt yourself, willing to question, willing to stop at a garage sale on a Saturday morning because you never know what you might find." Fainzel approached Webb, and this time there was no kneeling, no religious fervor. Just one being acknowledging another. "I will return to my order and share what I've learned today. That our scriptures speak of certainty and divine purpose, because those are easy to write down, easy to follow. But the real lesson, the one between the words, is that doubt is sacred too. That questions are prayers. That uncertainty is its own kind of faith." He touched one scarred hand to his chest in a gesture of respect. "Thank you, human, for showing us that the universe doesn't need heroes who are certain. It needs people who are willing to be wrong and try anyway." Over the following weeks, as Earth and the galactic community processed what had happened, Webb found himself back in the routine of his life. Missions, reports, the occasional diplomatic function where people looked at him with a mixture of awe and confusion, unsure how to treat the man who'd negotiated with the void using a $5 garage sale sword. But what stayed with him wasn't the cosmic significance or the near-miss extinction event. It was simpler than that. It was the memory of Saturday mornings, of stopping to look at things other people walked past, of his grandfather teaching him that curiosity wasn't just about finding answers, it was about being willing to sit with questions, about how the most valuable things in life are rarely the ones we search for deliberately. They're the ones we stumble across when we're open to possibility, when we're willing to see potential in the discarded and forgotten. When we spend $5 on something because it might be interesting, because it might have a story, because we might be wrong about what we think we know. The sword hung on his wall now, returned to its proper place as a family heirloom with an impossible history. Sometimes late at night, Webb would look at it and wonder about all the other garage sales happening across the galaxy. All the artifacts and relics and impossible things hiding in plain sight. All the people who might stop and look and ask themselves if that old book or strange compass or tarnished mirror might be more than it appears. And he'd smile, because the answer was always the same. Maybe. Maybe not. And in that uncertainty, in that space between knowing and not knowing, the universe found room to breathe, room to grow, room to continue being the beautiful, chaotic, impossible thing it had always been. Not certain, not absolute, just possible. And possibility, as it turned out, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything, because at the end of the day, salvation didn't come from divine weapons or cosmic artifacts or beings of unlimited power. It came from a choice made by someone standing in a spare bedroom, surrounded by boxes and uncertainty, who decided that maybe the universe didn't need him to have all the answers. Maybe it just needed him to keep asking questions. Maybe the most profound truth in all of existence is that we're all just stopping at garage sales, looking at things we don't fully understand, deciding whether to spend $5 on possibility. And sometimes, just sometimes, that's exactly what saves everything.